Welcome back to Behind the Play. My name is Alex Adams, and today I'm very excited to introduce Travis Yost of TSN. Thanks so much, Travis, for taking the time and coming on the podcast.
Anytime. How you doing, man?
I just want to ask you first a little bit about your career, Travis. When did you first think you might want to pursue a career in sports journalism?
I'm still thinking about that. Fun fact, still my side job. However, I think you ask a really important question, right? It's a very different reality for people in the workforce right now. There are a lot of people with two jobs, even people who are insanely successful in their first career. A lot of people do it either for hobbies or side jobs or additional income, whatever the case is. But when I was doing my undergrad, I did my undergrad at Arizona State, and at the time, I had, let's say, time to kill on weeknights and started watching a ton of out of market hockey and then started writing about it. And I did that for the first about year or so. We started covering the Ottawa Senators over at Hockey Buzz. And I had the point I'm trying to get to is I had utterly no idea that I was doing anything other than just like something out of self enjoyment. Like, I write some thoughts about a hockey team and people seem to care about this. And I'm not entirely sure why anyone would read me. And then my readers went from like 10 to 100 to 1,000 to 10,000, right? And it just kept multiplying. And the thing that I did not realize I was doing, it was a feedback loop, right? The more I was writing, the better I was getting at it. And the better I was getting at it, the more people were reading. And the more reliable I was putting content out there, the more frequently people were checking. But about 2010, I started really getting into hockey analytics because separate to this, my real career and what I tend to be competent at in life, which there's very few things in that bucket, by the way, is I really am driven and motivated and interested in numbers. And I thought that this was a massive missing niche or realm in the world of hockey coverage. And I felt then the same way I do 13 years later, which is freakish to say, but it's a massive area of opportunity for organizations. It's become kind of the ground zero of what I write and how I write. And I've stayed on with I signed on with TSN. I spent time writing at the Sporting News and the Ottawa Citizen and all paid jobs at that point. And I was like, wow, people are paying me to write about stuff that I cannot believe this would have ever happened 5 years prior to that. I've been at TSN since 2014. This is actually my 9th year. This will be the 9th. I always say TSN is Travis Sports Network in the summer because anyone important gets the summer off and then they let her rip in the summer. So I get a good 8-week stretch here when everyone else is on vacation, but really enjoying it and really the one thing I would emphasize is a lot of it was just repetition of something that I enjoyed doing. And now it's actually not only become a regular and reliable income stream for me on something I enjoy doing, it's supplemented my real career. I find myself to be a very strong communicator, very efficient, technically speaking. I've learned to comprehensive levels R and Python and ways to code and ways to capture data and data mine and all of this. It's like a tree with many different branches and tentacles, and you don't realize it until you're kind of deeper down the road.
What you mentioned how you feel as though the NHL or the game of hockey is kind of missing stuff and analytics kind of clogs that hole. What do you think people are missing in the game that analytics bring to the game of hockey and that you think are really important that people might miss?
Just like you can be a bad numbers guy or a bad scout or anything, there's nuance to every niche, right? But the reality is the eyes of humans lie to themselves all the time, me, you, and everyone else on the planet. And you hear horror stories sometimes of whether it's the scouting world in particular or organizational decision making. And by the way, this is not unique to hockey. It's every industry for the most part now, where the justification to do something or not to do something had no mathematical underpinning. And I think that's like a minimum bar of expectations to clear in 2023. It's not that I'm a believer that everything can be quantified, right? And it just a lot of times it just takes effort. It just takes effort, right? And there's always the question of is it overkill? How much do you want to toss away qualitative analysis and scouting? I see all that stuff as complementary, right? Like if you were to unleash a numbers only driven organization in the NHL, just as an example, it would fail miserably, right? Because you don't have a core component of the nuance of the context that you're going to get from video analysis. Just as one example, right? the same way I believe that, I'm very reticent, and I'm very, I shrug off the notion when I hear, and it's still rampant in the NHL, less so in some of the other sports leagues, where scouting is, I can get into a building, I can spend 3 hours watching a game, I know exactly what happened, I close up the briefcase, I head home. Not, it's rampant still in the league in 2023.
Mm.
And quite frankly, the organizations that think that way, first off, they're much smaller in number relative to where they are 10 years ago, and I think that's obvious. But you see themselves differentiating themselves in a bad way. There are very few of those organizations that are tending the cream of the crop. And you look around the league right now: Tampa, Carolina, Colorado, Vegas. I mean, these are organizations that they have brilliant hockey on ice. They have brilliant hockey minds. They have brilliant scouting departments, but they've really been able to complement a lot of that by doing it the right, with a mathematical broach, kind of underpinning or supplementing what they do. And to me, if nothing else, it becomes a good buyback, and it's a way to make organizations more sensitive to risk. You think of some of the worst decisions, the ones that we've all mocked over the last 10 years, many of which we knew at the time, not in hindsight. Almost every single one of them, the numbers were screaming, blinking red lights, bad move, right? Whether it was the Milan Lucic contract, I make fun of the Mikhail Granlund deal in Pittsburgh. It made it the trade deadline, but another just classic. Your risk reward was so negative and so muted that it was illogical to think that would have panned out. And it's not to say numbers guys get it right all the time, the same way scouts don't get it right all the time, but it's got to be complementary to one another.
And how would you say you weight it? Like you said, it's more quantitative, like that's kind of the basis for you, but how would you maybe weight the qualitative or kind of the eye test, for lack of a better word, compared to maybe the numbers?
It's a really good question. It's something I've learned to do more over the years. That kind of one of those learned experiences. There was a point where, I think I personally tipped the seesaw a little bit too much towards numbers driven approach. Even if I think the numbers are lying to me, trust them. And I've learned to take a more contextual or nuanced approach. And what I mean by that is, a lot of the times when I see something, and I'll give you an example in a minute, when I see something that is strikingly variant to what I would have suspected, I'll go back and rewatch these games, and I'll watch segments or shifts of a player, and I'll try to better understand, especially now as the art of the game, or the science of the game, has moved away from goals, assists, points, block shots, and hits. Like, I think a lot of people have latched onto the idea of, like, lines matter, pairings matter, 5-man units matter, team, chemistry can be quantified. And I'm a firm believer in that.
Mm.
And a lot of times it's understanding how players impact one another. One of the first indicators for me, and it took me years to get there. But we always joke as a community about, like, the dominance of, first was Pavel Datsyuk, right, Hall of Famer, Patrice Bergeron, Hall of Famer, how they have a rising tide lifts all boats impact, right? Anyone who plays with them is automatically better. But then I think the player that really flipped me to it in a unique way was Mark Stone, because he was not the caliber of player of Pavel Datsyuk or Patrice Bergeron, but he was so two-way dominant. And every player that plays with Mark Stone to this day is materially better. And I remember just watching some of his 2015, 2016 shifts in Ottawa, trying to understand how a player on such a middling, mediocre team could have such an outsized impact. And he's not a freakish skater. He's not an 18% shooter. Very good defensively, but, like, what's the impact he's having? Fast forward to the example I was going to give you. I spent some time obviously covering the Golden Knights, and they were run through the Stanley Cup this year at TSN quite a bit. You could write about almost every player there. Everyone is a unique story. I've been very curious about Brett Howden, who was kind of like a dumpster dive ad for the Vegas Golden Knights. He becomes the third man on a 3-man band with Mark Stone and Chandler Stevenson. And it's like, okay, well, you went from fourth liner once again to now playing on a truly robust top 6. But if you watch Brett Howden in the playoffs, and then you watched him when he was with the Rangers, you can see a player who plays so more confidently and has so much more spatial awareness because of the competency of his line mates. And is that a skill of Brett Howden? Maybe, maybe not. But to me, it's a testament to the coaching staff that they're able to get more out of that player than other coaching staffs may have in the past. It was obvious in the numbers. It's not something I would have believed watching him, because I would have said, hey, Mark Stone and Chandler Stevenson are driving that line. But then you watch the line player, you watch the 5-man unit play, and Brett Howden's creating havoc in front of the net. He's doing all the little things right. It's not to say he's driving the bus on that line, but he is additive on that line. And those are the sorts of things that you're not going to get unless you actually go through the video again.
I want to go off that a little bit because a lot of questions I have and I've read and seen about is the difference between the regular season and the playoffs. And for you, do you see that in the numbers? Do you see specific maybe metrics that kind of seem to be more determinant of winning in the playoffs compared to the regular season? Maybe just talk about that in terms of the numbers from the playoffs and the regular season.
I do think there's one thing that I find hilarious is each postseason seems to take a unique storyline that doesn't follow future or prior postseason. So for example, the NHL has been in this like 3-year blistering scoring run where you can't slow it down. Everyone loves it by and large. It's better for the league. And then this postseason scoring was down like 7%, right? And it was relative to the regular season. And sometimes it's like whack-a-mole. And by the way, the inherent volatility in playoffs, you get a white-hot goalie, team's going to Sergei Bobrovsky took Florida through, and then they get to Vegas and they look like the 8th seed in the East, right? And it's as soon as he capitulates. So there's truly a ton of randomness when it comes to the Stanley Cup playoffs. The one thing I do believe is I think there's two takeaways from this year in particular. One is unique to Vegas, and one is true of Vegas, but I think true for a number of teams. The first, and I'll work in that order. The first is that building a championship team means building a contender for a long time. And I don't know how many examples we need of that. It feels like an obvious point. But people use it usually to make fun of teams like the Calgary Flames, and they're not alone in that. But it's like Vegas has been in the league 6 times. What is it? They've been to the Eastern Conference Final like 4 times, Stanley Cup twice, like just a remarkable run. But I could say that another way, right? 5 of 6 seasons they failed, right? And they won the Stanley Cup. And by the way, it's true for Vegas. It's true for Colorado. It's true for Tampa Bay just in recent years. It may very well be true for the Toronto Maple Leafs, or the Toronto Maple Leafs may go the way of the San Jose Sharks, another unbelievable regular season team year after year after year 10 years ago that never got over the hill. Reality is you need more than one bite at the apple. And I compare that to a team. And by the way, I think they're very well built, but like you look at the moves the Rangers made at the trade deadline, bringing in Tarasenko, bringing in Patrick Kane. And there's always going to be time and opportunity for rentals. It's not a comment of being anti-rental, but it does make you, I think, adjudicate risk a little more differently when you are cashing in current and future assets to take that bite of the apple. And maybe you're trying to take a bigger bite in one given year. I think that can be justified, but you have to understand the opportunity cost of that if it doesn't work out. And the reality is, I don't care who you are or how good your team is, the odds are always against you, no matter what, right? It's just the reality of a 1 versus 15 scenario when you get to the playoffs. So that's one. The other one that I think is unique for team building, it's such a true comment in the modern era. You cannot win in this league without having minimum 3 quality lines, and usually 4. It is exceptionally hard. One of the reasons I was bullish on the Edmonton Oilers for the first time this year and a little bit of last year and never before that is they actually have started to build out that middle 6 so that they weren't getting their clock cleaned further down the lineup. We've seen any number of teams, whether it was San Jose in years past, the Anaheim Ducks when they had the Getzlaf Perry line clicking, the very top, or the Edmonton Oilers predating like 2019, 2020, very top heavy teams that are very challenged when they play quality opponents in the playoffs. It's why I have, among all the organizations in the NHL right now, I think you could make an argument that the Carolina Hurricanes are the most well run. I mean, I look at that lineup top to bottom. They fell short once again. There are people that are going to nitpick their ability to convert on scoring chances. I think it's a genuine issue with the team. They lack finishing talent again. But I also would emphasize that prior to this being an issue, it was Carolina can't buy a save. They don't have a goaltender, and they resolved that. And it goes to the original point I made, which is building a contender is perpetual, right? You're consistently trying to build a quality lineup. And Carolina, if nothing else, they're going to give you 4 quality lines and 2 to 3 really dangerous pairings. And it's why they're so dominant in the regular season. They blow the doors off teams. And more, if you can sign a Connor McDavid type to a $13 million deal, you don't even blink, right? You sign that deal immediately. But the reality is, if whether it's through drafting and developing and having a cost-friendly bottom six that can deliver, or just being smart with your additions, players like Ivan Barbashev for Vegas, just as one of many examples. I rounding out those lineups is very important. You cannot just win off your top line or a top six anymore.
And with that, I want to ask you a little bit about goaltending, because in a cap world, you can't spend as much as you want on anyone. And there's kind of this debate now with Adin Hill winning the Stanley Cup, and obviously Vasilevsky and Hellebuck might get traded and signed to a big deal. But so in your mind, with goaltending in a cap world, what is better? Is it to prioritize maybe a tandem like Carolina, like Vegas, or is it to pay for an elite goalie if it's someone of the ilk of maybe a Hellebuck or a Vasilevsky?
Yeah, so fascinating question. I think I would argue this is probably the most debated question in organizations right now, by the way, for roster building. So the way me and you are shooting the shit about it is the same way that, 32 GMs are thinking about it the same way. I think the rule, and this is it's not a hard and fast rule, but it's the tandem is going to be one much more cap friendly and allow you to chase advantages, especially advantages where you may have more confidence in your investment. I make this point all the time. Teams are much more confident in the way they're willing to pay forwards than they are defensemen, and they're way more confident in the way they're willing to pay defensemen than they are goaltenders. Right? Goaltenders are extremely volatile. They're Adin Hill's yet one of endless examples of a guy who it seemed like he flipped a switch right overnight. And by the way, that switch might flip right back down next year, right? So who knows? That I think it's absolutely worth chasing the platoon in the absence of that elite number one goaltender, because it is going to be more cost advantageous to teams, generally speaking. That with that said, that shouldn't make teams reticent to signing star goaltenders, because having a goaltender who can outperform on a nightly basis is one of the biggest advantages you can have. It might be the biggest advantage.
Yeah.
The question is, can you actually find a goaltender who's going to yield that? For many years, and by the way, I may change this line of thought 2 years from now again. For many years, I've kind of kicked this around, and I have never been the goaltenders are voodoo and just throw up your hands and just spin a wheel. I think there's has to be more to a science than that. I feels a little lazy, even if the broad and overarching point is it's hard to predict, which is true. I wrote something last year, and man, I really should do a deeper dive on it maybe this off season. But the one thing that I think is worth chasing when you pay for goaltenders isn't necessarily outperformance. It's reliability. And what I mean by reliability, the example I used last summer was why it made sense to pay Darcy Kemper. And their argument for Darcy Kemper was this: no matter what year you looked at, Darcy Kemper's range of performance ranged from good to very good. And there's some seasons that he was good, top 10, top 12 goalie. There's some seasons he was very good, top 6, top 7 goaltender. Your confidence in that goaltender delivering a quality season in subsequent years is very high. Or alternatively, if you're risk averse, your risk assessment of him relative to almost every other goalie in the league is going to be much more muted, because it's the guy is generally incapable of stinkers, right? And it's, again, this is not foolproof. Injuries happen, fatigue happens. Goaltenders go through any number of things the same way all professional athletes do. But in that same argument, it was an argument against a goaltender like Jack Campbell, right? And the Jack Campbell deal has completely blown up in Edmonton. Yeah. And a lot of that, and I think, and again, this is a little bit of an argument of convenience, I concede, but the argument there, right? Darcy Kemper's track record was much more robust. It was much longer in the tooth. Jack Campbell's performance not only was starting to capitulate towards the tail end of the prior year in Toronto, his range of outcomes was much wider, much wider.
Yeah.
And that is always a little bit scary. I will actually slap myself on the wrist for one example, and I'll tell you where the Darcy Kemper gambit would fail. Robin Lehner would be a good example of that. Now, Robin Lehner has been a very reliable goaltender in the NHL, but what happened here? He ran into significant injury problems. He's got multiple hip issues. Robin Lehner may not even play again. We have no idea the status of Robin Lehner. So that's a deal that would have blown up in your face. Do teams and organizations and fans have more time for, injuries set this guy career back and we kind of have to pick up the pieces? Absolutely. I think that's a much more digestible miss than signing a player to a bad deal where there was inherent risk. But again, that's my point, right? You're working like 80th, 85th percentile. You're trying to get most right. I always argue that a sign of a great GM is his good deals to bad deals are outweighed 4-1. And the point is, I don't care who your favorite GM is. I can go find some stinkers, right? And it's inevitable. But on average, it's the Kyle Dubas argument, right? Go criticize the Nick Foligno deal all day long. I will join you the same way that everyone else will. Go criticize him over what they did with Jerry McCann. I will as well. But if you're going to bring up those two examples, I can give you 10 that outweigh them, right? And that's how to me, you measure a good front office.
And I want to go a little bit on the Leafs because you had an interesting tweet about Austin Matthews and that he'd be a fool to sign an 8-year deal with Toronto. Maybe talk about why you think that, and maybe is Matthews kind of changing the game in terms of high profile players choosing to kind of bet on themselves more like the NBA in terms of short-term contracts to maximize their value?
Yeah, I got beat up for this, and I'm like, man, there's sometimes I get beat up for saying something, and I'm like, man, I think about it the next day and you're like, yep, I kind of understand why. I struggled with this one for two reasons. Number one, inherently, or what should have been obvious, right? There is a very real cap landscape change in front of the NHL in the next few years. And it's two-tailed, right? Not only is the growth of the current cap extremely tight, which is restricting not just Toronto, but every other team in the league and their ability to spend, and what that maximum dollar looks like. That's piece of it. The other piece is there is multiple looming rights deals in front of the NHL that is inherently going to lift the cap. And we saw it to an extreme level in the NBA. I want to say about 5 seasons ago that took the cap, I think, up like $20 million in a blink. Don't quote me on the number. It was an insane amount though. And I don't expect that to be the case for the NHL, but if you look at it from Austin Matthews' perspective, it's not just the total compensation package, which I think he's more than earned. I think he's a top 3 player in the league. It's also like, if you take him at his word, he wants to win. This is not at all a comment about the Maple Leafs, but the comps I kept, people are saying, well, you didn't say this about Jesper Bratt. Jesper Bratt is not an Austin Matthews comp, so stop sending me that. Then you send it, oh, well, what about Nathan MacKinnon? Look at what Nathan MacKinnon has that Austin Matthews does not, right? And a lot of what the NHL is about is, especially these guys that are ultra athletes, ultra competitive, they want to get paid. They want to maximize their earnings in just like anyone else on planet Earth. But many of these guys are wired, I want to win a title. And quite frankly, that you can't have a media landscape that talks about why the Maple Leafs cannot get over the hill over and over and over and over all day, every day. And in my opinion, justified at this point, considering how good they've been in the regular season and how much they've struggled in the playoffs. You can't juxtapose that against, why wouldn't Austin Matthews sign an 8-year deal in Toronto? It's like, maybe that's why. Like, I don't know. I feel like that's a reasonable counter argument. Yeah. So to me, like the argument that I think about Matthews, and maybe this is where I should have went a little more wordy. Like if Matthews, he's got all the cards in the deck, right? If Matthews wants to stay in Toronto, he absolutely can, because he's going to get that 8-year extension, whether it's today or next year or 2 years from now. Yeah. He can sign a 2-year deal, a 3-year deal in Toronto right now, maximize his earnings on that deal, and come 2 years from now, yes, he accepts the risk of a major injury railroading this, and that's on him and the player agent, and that's a decision they have to make. But realistically speaking, two-ish years from now, he could be in line to sign another 8-year deal that's 10 to 15% larger than the 8-year deal he would have signed now. So it's beneficial to the player. It's also benefit not just from a comp piece, but also from, am I setting myself up in a way to win the title? I would love to see, not an Austin Matthews comment, more of a general NHL cap comment. I'd love to see shorter contracts in terms of max term. I don't think the 8-year deals. I don't know if the NBA's 5-year max deals is the right number, but I think the 8-year deals are a little bit too restrictive, especially now where we know what drives a lot of coverage is speculation, free agent signings, trades. I mean, that's a lot. All of these sports leagues that are 12 months a year are driven in large part off of what could happen. And it's weird to juxtapose that against the NHL that literally just after July 7th, it's like, we're going to shut the doors until September 15th. We'll see you in Pennington. That's effectively what the NHL is. So I think there's opportunity there too, from a business standpoint.
I want to ask you a little bit about the Sens. Obviously, you covered them for a while. I'm here in Ottawa, but what do you make of maybe like the new ownership? How bright do you think the future is, and maybe what do you think will happen with Debrincat? He seems to be out, but what do you think Dorion should do? Should he go for more future? Should he go for more win now? What do you just make of the Sens and their outlook going into next year?
Um, I would say their outlook is neutral, slightly positive. I'll tell you why. If I had to grade everything, negatives and positives, the thing that I think that stands out to me most is I do believe in their young core. I think it's a tip of the cap to Pierre Dorion and the scouting department and what they've been able to amass over the years. And let's call a spade though on this. Like, they completely destructed the organization to get to this point. But I don't know how many times I've tweeted it. I don't know how many times I've written about it. With all the Brady Tkachuk and Thomas Chabot love that exists, completely justified. I think Tim Stützle is on the road to superstardom in a way that these other guys are not, and I mean that in a truly good way. I think the lineup is reasonably deep enough to be a fringe playoff contender. I still think the defense needs work. I know there are a number of people that think this summer is hinging a lot on what they do in net. I think that's also reasonable. It's a team with holes, but I think it's also a team with talent. I do think the part that scares me is the front office. And so I think when you raise the question of what does Pierre Dorion do this summer, I don't necessarily, I think a lot of this is going to be contingent on what the ownership timeline looks like and how willing they are to make decisions. I don't know that Pierre Dorion has necessarily earned himself more time in the seat. When I mentioned the good move to bad move ratio, he'd be pretty low on that list. Like I said, feather in his cap on the scouting and draft and development side, but I take the feather out because the Ottawa Senators have to be a bottom 5 team in the league when it comes to evaluating NHL talent.
Yeah.
They have to be one of the worst organizations, and time and again they lose these trades, and it is apparent, it is obvious. I've seen arguments, and there's probably truth to it. Under-resourced, underfunded scouting departments, no hockey analytics department that exists in reality. A GM that was under the thumb of old ownership, like it runs the gamut. So that, again, just like every other organization, there's nuance there. I don't think he's done a terrible job, but you look at the moves. It's hard to compare what it's hard to look at Ottawa's front office and then look at a Carolina or a Tampa or a Colorado and this goes on and on and on at this point. Now it's not just 3 teams, and say, yep, we're on par, right? It's just, you're lying to yourself, right? So I expect that there's likely going to be change there. I think it would be justified. On the Debrincat question in particular, I don't think, and I think I said this last week when it became pretty obvious that he was going to leave. I wouldn't grade this as necessarily an outright bad move by the Senators, but in hindsight, it was a miss. They were bad when they acquired him. They did not reach the postseason or come close with him. And now they're staring over the barrel of moving him or give a qualifying offer at 7.2 or something. That's just not going to happen, right? So they're going to lose the player. The one saving grace is he was good enough on an otherwise mediocre team that I think they'll be able to recoup assets as part of this trade. But again, like the same reason that I make the Matthews point about like, be smart now because you can be really smart later. There aren't a ton of teams that are like, yeah, I can drop $10 million on Alex Debrincat AAV. Like there just isn't. And there's going to be more in a year or two. So maybe Ottawa gets 95 cents on the dollar. And that's, in terms of sunk cost, that's pretty muted. And you know what, maybe job well done there. But again, there's just, it's not that the Debrincat trade or the decision was bad. I actually I think at times he was good for the team. It just goes, you can't measure it as a win, right? And those losses continue to pile up under this current front office. And I do think, I think maybe one of the more interesting debates in Ottawa that I think is a genuine debate, because I think there's arguments on both sides, is do you go after the coaching staff first? Because I know there's frustration with DJ Smith. That's always the easier bullet to fire anyway, in fairness. Or do you go after the front office? My argument on the front office piece, by the way, just to kind of pull this full circle, because I think the coaching argument is a slightly easier one to make, maybe has merit too. Um, the average time, most teams who go through rebuilds return to the postseason within a 5-year window. I wrote this last year. And if you have a really successful rebuild, it's about 3 years. Now, get me wrong, right? It's a wide distribution. We've seen teams rebuild, and Ottawa 2011, 2012, right? We've seen teams rebuild 18 months later. You're like, they're in the playoffs. Like, what happened here, right? So it's not so much a rebuild. But most teams get there by year 5, which makes sense, right? You think about it, you're trading away players for a year or two, you're recouping assets. Now these assets are finishing their entry level contracts, potentially in the NHL. They're getting better. So you're starting building the contender. How many years is Ottawa into this now, right? So it's going on 7, right? It's going on 7. So they are easily on the far right tail of that distribution at this point. And I think that, you can put that at the feet of DJ Smith to some degree, but you can't put it all the way there. And that is the argument that I would make to people who say it's Smith that's kneecapped Dorion. Even if I say, hey, look, he's been a negative behind the bench, that's a tough pill to swallow. I think if you're making a save the GM, get rid of the coach argument, it's just taken way too long, and the team's just not there yet.
I guess my last question on that just quickly is, how much do you think there may be lack of depth, which they've had for a long, long time, hampers them going forward because they've traded out so many assets for a guy like Debrincat, for Chikrin, for et cetera?
It's not only that too, right? Like this is something I believe a ton in. The one thing that the numbers world does very, very well at, maybe the best relative to scouts. And by the way, there's a ton of things scouts do better, way relative to numbers guys. It's finding those diamond in the rough types who are maybe, and usually it's their on ice numbers are better than their counting stats. And quite frankly, organizations miss this way too frequently. It's more of the play drivers, the possession drivers. They might be extremely good attacking the puck off puck in the neutral zone. They might be great defensively in the defensive third. But there's a lot of evidence that they are driving on ice performance. They don't have Ottawa. Like, just look at what occupied the bottom 6 and the players that rotated in that lineup this year, whether it was Austin Watson or Patrick Bound or Derek Brassard. I mean, it's just a lot of guys who just aren't very good, and it's hard to understand what they are doing additively for lineups. And like, I remember we talked about 12, 13 years ago, Ottawa had one of the best examples of a guy who you're like, is that guy any good? But he was insanely good. And it was Eric Condra. We used to talk about him all the time as a 4th line winger. He maybe gave you 10 goals a year, maybe. But I'll tell you what, no team outscored Eric Condra when he was on the ice, right? It was obvious evidence that he was persistently playing in the offensive zone and driving play. David Moss, Nicholas Chalmerson. I mean, there's a laundry list of guys who weren't sexy names, but really delivered value in a way that wasn't obvious in the counting stats. If you look at organizations that are well run, and you look at how organizations that are so run or poorly run, that tends to be one of the differentiators. You look further down the lineup, and it's, you play against the Carolina 3rd or 4th line, they're gonna feed you in. Right? They're gonna knock your teeth out. You play against Ottawa's 4th line, you're going to run them over. And that's a big differentiator between the two teams right now. And in the modern era, so competitive, margins very thin, it matters a lot.
Well, Travis, I absolutely love this conversation. This was great. Thanks so much for doing this. Anything at TSN or anywhere else that you want to plug before you head off?
No, I'm just begging you guys, keep reading in the summer. I know everyone goes to the cottages, but I know you got internet there. Travis Sports Network until September 15th, until all the important people come back. So please, I save all my deep dive, all the questions you guys ask me, all the stuff that I'm like, that's a big project, and there's no way I can get to it in the middle of January. That's the stuff that I go after in the summer. So please keep reading in the summer, and then you can stop reading me come September.
Well, I'll definitely be reading you this summer, and thanks so much, Travis, for taking the time and coming on.
All right, man. Take care. Appreciate you.